Hey, Memorial Church family. Jeff Lincecum here. It is January 30th, 2022. If you were in worship this morning, you know that I was not there. I was fully planning on being there and excited to be there. Being in worship with all of you has been just one of the highlights of life right now. I'm so grateful for that and us studying our Genesis and the beginnings of our faith. But as you probably heard, we came into contact with COVID yesterday. It took us by surprise. And because of that, and because of our protocols here at Memorial Church, I was unable to come to worship this morning. And so I'm grateful that we're a church that protects each other and supports each other. And I really want to give thanks to Susan Mozina for pinch hitting, preaching this morning, for the great staff, for you all at Memorial Church. I was so bummed to miss the ordination this morning and installation. We watched it online as a family this morning. So proud of this place. And I'm so sad to not be here, but so grateful for this great church family as we are in the midst of these crazy times. That being said, I was so excited to preach this morning that what I decided to do is come into the church right now. It's in the afternoon on Sunday. No one's here. And decided to just tape this sermon for you all as we continue to look through the beginnings of our faith and continue on with this study. We're studying today the story of Noah and the ark, maybe one of the most well-known, I suppose, stories in the Old Testament. If you're like me, I can still remember being a kid in Sunday school with the flannel graph little animals going onto Noah's ark right on the flannel board in our Sunday school classrooms. But what we know about this story, right, is that it's not just a kid's story, that it's really a story for all of us about the beginnings, in some ways, of our faith and what we believe about this God that we worship. And that's why this story is so important to us, because what it really is a story about our God. And what is it about our God? That we have a God who remembers. That we have a God who remembers. And so for just a few minutes, I want to talk about that. I'm going to read for us briefly just a few verses. This is from Genesis chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, and the birds and domestic animals, and every animal on the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of my covenant that I make between you and me and every living creature for all generations. I have set my bow in the clouds between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." Amen. This is the word of the Lord for us. Thanks be to God. Friends, my hunch is that in all of our studies or somewhere in our house or maybe in our offices at work, we all have these things that are mementos for us, right, to remind us. Maybe it's pictures of our family at special times. Maybe it's a plaque of an award you won. Maybe it's your college degrees that you hang to remember those things by. Maybe it's a piece of sports memorabilia that's important to you. It's interesting, Jim Schultz, our operations director here, he in his office has this awesome Steve Yzerman from the Red Wings jersey that is signed by Yzerman. It's incredible, right? And we all have those sort of things to remember, things to remind us about something that is important in our life. Well, I brought something from my office that I wanted to show you all today. I'm just going to bend down and get it. My hunch is that this will be the most unique office decoration that you've ever seen. I'm just guessing that, and it's been in my offices since I got it, and so I'm going to show it to you and see what you think. It's this life preserver right here, and no, this is not a children's sermon. This is the real sermon here. It's this life preserver. I have it in my office not because I am wonderful at water sports. Frankly, I can hardly swim. And it's not because I think that the church is going to flood and I'm going to need it on the second floor in my office. I have this because of what it reminds me of and actually who it reminds me of. I got this a few years ago when my church and I were working at a UN refugee camp on the island of Lesbos off of Greece. It's actually an island in Greece. And we were there because we were serving the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugees that were coming over, especially from the Syrian civil war, as they're fleeing Al-Qaeda, as they're fleeing all of the different factions to find freedom. And these are doctors, nurses, lawyers, educated family people like you and I. And yet they're fleeing this place because of what they were leaving, the death that they were leaving, and trying to find a new life. And so they would come through Turkey. They would pay money to these smugglers. They would be thrown on these rafts. And maybe you remember seeing those rafts, remember, filled with 100 people, rafts that are made for 15, 20 people, and they're just stacked full of 100 people. The smugglers would basically start an engine and send it off across the way and say, good luck. And they would put them in life preservers like this. Some of these life preservers even just have cardboard in them. They don't even have foam in them, right? And many of them died in the middle of that channel. But then those who came through and made it through, they would get off on the other side. And this is where we would receive them. And they would strip off these life preservers, kind of in an act of freedom and of salvation in some ways. And they would walk their way into this camp called Moria to try to find some sort of new way of life into the free world. So I keep this in my office, right? Because I need to remember that. I need to remember that in my life. I need to remember my friends Saman and Muhammad and others that I met. I need to remember that this world is not filled with people who live like me and you. But this world is filled with people that the world forgets. And it behooves me to have something that I can hold, that I can look at to remember by. Our text for today reminds us of that, right? This idea of the importance of being remembered and remembering things. Let's look at it for a second. Genesis 9, where we've come from, is the story of the flood, right? And what's interesting, just a quick reminder, when we come at Scripture, it's really important for us to know the importance of Scripture is not to tell us about science necessarily. It's not actually sort of a history lesson. It's really a theological book. It is words to describe who God is and who that God thinks us to be, right? And taking the experiences of the day and running them through this lens of who is this God that we worship. And the reality is, and we talked about this a few weeks ago when we talked about creation, that every single culture has their own creation story. Every single culture has their story of how God made the world and made us. And in fact, lots of different cultures in our spiritual ancestors' time also had flood stories, like the one we read. Let me give you an example, the Mesopotamian flood story. This is fascinating. The story is, they would say it this way: once upon a time there was a god named Enlil. Enlil was the god of the atmosphere. And this god, Enlil, was trying to take a nap. And yet the human creatures on the earth were so loud that it was disrupting Enlil's sleep. And so what does Enlil do? But he decides that he's going to flood the earth. He's the god of the atmosphere. Flood the earth to destroy all the human beings. Well, the other gods in the Godhead say, that's a little bit of overkill, Enlil. And so what do? But they get one man and his family, tip them off, say, this is going to happen. You better get on a boat and save yourself from the flood that's happening. Right? Isn't that interesting? That's the end of the story. Isn't that interesting? Think of how similar that is to our own flood story. And these were the stories that were around in the area. There clearly was some sort of a flood in this area, at least, that made this story come to life. But think about what that says about the God that these folks worship, right? It's important. Remember, the reason why we look at beginnings is not just to know the stories, but to understand who the God is that story tells us that we worship. Think about if that was the God that you worshiped. If you worshiped this God who destroyed people with their tears to flood because they were mad about not taking a nap. It would say to you that we have an angry God, a God who sort of does stuff sort of haphazardly, right? It says to us that we have a God who doesn't really bother by us, but is maybe more bothered by us. And maybe this is the most important thing. There's no sense that this is not going to happen again, right? If the gods can get that angry over something, how can we possibly control that this could ever happen again, right? And that's the kind of God that these folks worshipped. And what it said about them, right, is that they have a God who doesn't really think about them at all. In fact, it's interesting because for them, the rainbow in the sky was said to be Marduk's, one of the other major gods' bow. right? The God of judgment, the God of violence, the God who lords his power over the rest of the earth. That when they saw the bow, it was a sign of all these things. Think about what that says about that God and those gods and what it says about us. We are people who would be forgotten. Friends, I think that's so important for us to know because I actually think this idea of being remembered is so core to our identity. And how easy is it for us to think sometimes that maybe God does not remember us? In my life as a pastor, in my years of pastoral ministry, I can honestly say I've had a chance to counsel and be with many, many folks. And I think the most painful thing for people to face is when they feel like they've been forgotten, when they have not been remembered, right? Because we know that's true. When you are remembered, when someone reaches out to you, when someone remembers you and knows your name, it lifts you up almost like you're on a flood and it's like an ark on a flood. It lifts you up, doesn't it? William H. Auden has this great poem called Night Mail, and I'm just going to read one line from it that rings so true when we talk about this. He says this, "And none will hear the postman's knock without a quickening of the heart. For who can bear to feel himself forgotten?" Isn't that beautiful? You hear the knock of the postman, you see the mail coming through the slot, and you think, well, what is that? I hope it's not just bills, right? If it's something else, if it's someone reaching out to us, how it lifts our spirits and our hearts. We know that's true. And yet how easy is it for us to know that we live in a world where it's easy to feel forgotten, and where we live in a world of forgotten people, whether it's the Syrian refugees that remain at Camp Moria on Lesbos, whether it's the people in our downtowns or people in places that are forgotten and underserved, and they're forgotten in this world. Maybe it's us, maybe it's you and me. If this pandemic has done anything, it's made us feel forgotten sometimes, right? Where we wonder if anybody even notices and knows. Remember Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" The reality is that we can sometimes feel forgotten by each other, but the reality is sometimes we can maybe even feel forgotten by our God. But see, that's where the good news of the story comes in for us today. Because what we believe and what our flood story tells us on the other side of it is that we worship a God who remembers. We worship a God who remembers. Think about what this God does after the flood. In some ways, that part of the story is the same, right? There is a flood. We believe there was a flood, and it wiped out much of humanity. But think about what God does after the flood. God makes this promise, and it's a promise to remember. Verse 11, "I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." Right? Now, of course, what is God saying? Of course, there's consequences for our misdeeds, right? There's consequences for wandering away from God, and it's sort of a moral lesson for us. That's really interesting, right? The rest of these cultures, there was no moral lesson. Is the moral lesson that if you're noisy, then the gods will get angry with you and flood you? That's not a moral lesson, right? This is a moral lesson. You wander away, you do things, there's going to be consequences for that. It comes at a cost. But what's different about our God that we worship is that this God says, I am not going to do that again. That going forward, there's going to be a new plan and is going to be new flourishing. No matter what you do, you cannot run away from my love for you. I am going to stay my hand, and I'm going to figure out a different way to redeem you. And then what does God do? God puts the bow in the sky, right? Remember, Marduk's bow was a bow of power and anger. When we see the bow in the sky, what is God calling us to do? Remember the covenant. And God even says, I'm going to remember the covenant when I see it as well. God will not forget God's promises. We worship a God who does not forget us. That is such good news. That is such good news. And so what are we going to take away from that today? I want to offer us two things that I would encourage you to try to do this week in your own spiritual life as we try to put this into practice. The first one is this: be on the lookout for signs that God remembers you. Be on the lookout for signs that God remembers you. Of course, the rainbow is one of those things, right? When we see a rainbow, we can remember God remembers us. But I've got to tell you, there are so many ways that I'm reminded that God remembers me on a regular basis. Do you know what one is? Worship in this sanctuary. Worship on these Sunday mornings. When we worship, I'm reminded that God remembers us, that I'm not alone. When I'm walking home at night, maybe some of you do this when you're driving around Grosse Pointe, and I hear the bells from our carillon ringing the hours, right? When I hear those bells, I am reminded that even though it's dark and even though it's night, that God remembers us, that we are not alone, that God marks our life and doesn't forget us. When you see a cross, maybe it's a cross on a wall in your house, maybe it's a cross on your neck, maybe it's even a cross tattoo that somebody has, right? We see those and we remember that we have a God who did not forget us, but remembers us and turns bad things into things that are good, right? Where do you need to be remembered today? This church is good at remembering. Think about even the name of our church, Grosse Pointe Memorial Church. It was named in memorial of people who'd gone before, right? Of parents who'd gone before, of people who've gone before. We are surrounded by saints, surrounded by people who've gone before us, who have seen God, who's remembered them and gives us hope. What can you do today? What can you see when you see it that reminds you that you have a God who remembers you? And then second and finally this, who are we called to go out and remember today? Maybe like me, it's the people in Camp Moria, the refugees that I see when I remember this, when I see this and remember. Maybe for you, it's them. Maybe it's for you, it's the people in Detroit or some other community that are underserved and unseen that you remember. Maybe it's someone in this church who you haven't seen since this pandemic has started. Maybe you haven't seen them in worship. Maybe you don't even know where they're at. What would it look like for you and me when we remember them today to say, I'm going to reach out to them. I'm going to write them a note. I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call them. I'm going to see how they're doing and check on them. Let me tell you, it would do two things. Number one, you are going to lift them. They might be drowning in the waters of COVID right now in this pandemic, this isolation. You will be lifting them up on the waters of this flood. But you know the other thing that you'd be doing when you remember them in this way? You are going to be emulating the God who remembers us. And so my challenge for all of us, look out, see the ways that God remembers you today. And then bring to mind someone, at least one person this week, who you remember, who you are feeling called today to reach out to. Remember this church. Maybe invite them back to worship if they're ready to come. Maybe just invite them out to coffee or do a Bible study with you on Zoom. I don't know what it is, but remember them. Because when we do, we are emulating the God who remembers us and who does not forget. Friends, that is good news for us. We're excited to be in worship this next week, God willing, and prayers for all of you and for the life of our church, this light on the lakeshore. God bless you.